Good morning, everyone. We're very happy to have you here from the team at DPAS. Um, Today's webinar, I'm going to be doing just the housekeeping and introduction now. After that, we're going to have our experts on the panel introduce one another, and then we're going to be having Ralph and Rowenna go through the entire presentation. If we could have the next slide for the panel, so I can just make the introduction. So my name is Kunbi. I work at DPAS as the Data Privacy Officer. I just completed my Master's in Commercial Law at the University of Exeter. In terms of housekeeping, before I ask our guests to introduce themselves, what we would like from you is to just kindly keep your microphones and cameras off, and also know that we're going to be recording the webinar. So if you miss any part of it, you can be assured you'll be able to get another look at everything that happens today. Also, we're going to be sending out a survey after the webinar, so please fill that in. It's just going to help us tailor these webinars going forward to make sure they're as responsive as possible to the needs of our audience. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the question box. Our experts are going to be responding to those questions as and when possible, but any questions that remain unanswered, the plan is to make sure that we get written responses and get them sent over so you can have the full benefit of the event. So now I'm going to invite Rowenna to please just give a brief introduction about herself.
Thank you so much, Kunbi. So I am Rowenna Fielding. I am a professional data protection nerd and information governance geek. I've been doing data protection and information governance for more than a decade, and I'm not going to get any more specific than that. I work with all kinds of organizations, big, small, public, private, third sector, and I never met a data protection problem that I didn't find fascinating, which makes me great fun at parties.
I can imagine that. Ralph,
I can vouch for that, actually. No, yeah, do you know what? A very, very similar background, except I'm going to raise you a decade. In fact, I'm almost going to raise you a decade and a half there. So yeah, this is almost my 25th year now of doing this data protection and privacy, human rights law. And what's more, just practical, helping organizations to adjust their ethics or risk management or legal compliance. As we know, none of those three are the same thing, but hopefully to help organizations, both large and small, to manage their responsibilities, not only under the law, but of course to the people that they serve. And that's, I think, where I'll leave it. Yeah, I could go on with the interesting fact about how much fun we are at parties, but moving swiftly on, I think we're going to go into the content of the day. So we've got quite a lot to cover today. Got quite a lot to cover. Some of the slides are quite wordy, for which I apologize in advance, but we'll be hopefully walking you through it. So we wanted to talk about marketing today. Which can be quite a tricky subject to talk about, because we're not just dealing with data protection law here, we're also dealing with PCR. And I think the case where most people really struggle here is to differentiate one from the other, where one applies, where the other applies, where they both apply. And that's going to be the focus of today's webinar, really. Then we're going to talk about what marketing is, what marketing isn't. The ICO has issued some guidance with some definition, and I'm sure my colleague Ro is going to have some very strong opinions on that as well. And then we're going to talk about different methodologies of marketing, because the rules might differ depending on if you're looking at posts, depending on if you're looking at email, depending on if you're looking at telephone, or indeed other sort of more targeted direct marketing. And of course, it's going to differ depending whether we're looking at what the e-privacy law or PCR calls individual subscribers or corporate subscribers. We'll talk about what that means, basically business to business or business to individuals. And then we're going to talk about the ICO guidance as well. But before we begin, it's really important to talk about the difference between, let's start off some Latin, shall we? So lex generalis or a lex specialis. As you know, even though we've left the EU, the influence of European law looms large. And so we have data protection law, which comes from the UK GDPR, which came from the EU GDPR. And we have an EU privacy law, an electronic privacy law, that we then have, we call a PCR. Now, what's interesting about this and makes the two work together pretty well, or not so well in some cases, is we have, is this PCR, this e-privacy law, comes from 2002, 2003, which means it was written with the older data protection directive in mind, the one from 1995. And now we've got this brand new spanking GDPR, this brand new spanking Data Protection Act. In fact, 2018, 2016, not so new anymore. But of course, we've got e-privacy law that predates that by a number of years. So Ro, perhaps I'm going to go over to you, Ro, and actually say, so what's the problem? What's the problem with having a sort of an older e-privacy law and a newer GDPR and data protection law?
Well, if you've got two things that rely on each other and depend on each other, and you change one of them and not the other, it does tend to make things confusing. Speaking of confusing, FYI to all of you out there, Ralph says PECR, I say PECA because it's easier and it's funny. But the key thing to remember here is that data protection law is not privacy law. Data protection is about protecting all individuals' rights and freedoms when it comes to collection, use, sharing, etc. of their data. Whereas e-privacy law is specifically about the confidentiality of electronic communication services. So that's a really important thing to remember when you're thinking about which bits of which law apply here. The answer is in what is it you're doing and why and how. So the data protection law is all about personal data, as you may be aware, I would hope. E-privacy law is about electronic communications and equipment. So while in data protection law, the focus is on the rights and freedoms of the data subject, the living natural person to whom the personal data is related. In PECA, it's about who's at the other end of the line, which used to be phone line, and now we have all these wonderful, clever wireless things, is now at the end of the virtual line. So data protection law, data, e-privacy law, electronic privacy. And where these intersect is where people are using corporations, governments, charities, organizations use both electronic communication systems and personal data to do stuff. That's where data protection and e-privacy overlap. And a lot of this overlap sits within the marketing space because turns out that electronic communication systems are really, really useful for sending people stuff that you want them to know.
Thank you, Ro. That's much appreciated. Yeah, so there'll be times when only the data protection law applies if you're dealing with personal data that isn't on a public telecommunications system. There'll be times when PCR or PECA applies, where you're using a public telecom system, but you're using something that doesn't use personal data. So PECA will apply in cases where you're not using personal data. But if you're using personal data on the public telecommunication systems, then both apply, and you actually have to satisfy both what we call the lex generalis, the general law, the data protection law, and then PECA, which we call the specialis, the special law. And so we have to understand the requirements. Now, this isn't a GDPR data protection law lecture or webinar. So, I would hope that most people are aware that you've got to follow the principles, right? You've got to follow the principles. And so anytime you're processing personal data, doesn't matter it's on a public telecommunication system or not, you've got to be transparent and fair. So, it's really important when we are marketing, of course, to make sure that people know that we're collecting their data. We know that, we're going to be fair in the way we do so. We have a legal basis to process it. And then we follow the rest of the principles about, only using it for the right purpose, collecting it and using the minimum that we can, making sure it's accurate, get rid of it when we no longer need it, keep it with the right level of security. And then most importantly around that, have that accountability elements where we're demonstrating our compliance. And that means quite often moving ahead of our sort of more legalistic approach where we react to what the law says and moving to a more proactive approach where it's more by design and we have the right and we've done the right sort of analysis before we begin to process that data. That's on the proactive side. Then, of course, we have the reactive side, which means people can exercise their rights. Now, there's loads of rights that will definitely apply to direct marketing here, and that will include telling people to not use the data for that reason. We call that restriction or purpose suppression. They might have a right to erasure, but generally speaking, that's really only if we're relying on consent. In fact, sometimes it's actually, actually worth not deleting the data in marketing terms because that means that if you delete the data, sometimes you've got no record not to market them again. Obviously, a right to the copy of the data, right to know that you've got the data, and actually the right of objection really comes into a play quite strongly for direct marketing. It's one of the few what I'd call absolute rights within our UK GDPR. One of the few rights that isn't qualified in any way. If they ask you to stop, you stop. On the flip side, we've got this idea of e-privacy or the PCR. And most important thing to understand is it's not just personal data and a completely separate set of requirements here. So it's not about private networks. So it's only what we call a public telecommunication network. And we tend to call people subscribers. It uses the term, rather than data subjects, it uses the term subscribers. And that's that sort of inconsistent terminology. So if you sign up to have an email address at Yahoo or Gmail or someone like that, you're a subscriber. You're an individual subscriber. You have an email address that they've provided you. You have subscribed to their service. But equally, if you have an email address at your company, well, it's your company that has subscribed to that email address. So you would call that company a corporate subscriber. So it does differentiate between this idea of you having your sort of business email address as a corporate subscriber and you having an email address as an individual subscriber, as a private citizen. Now it applies to anyone who's going to be a subscriber to one of these public telecommunication network services. And that definition is really wide ranging: email, fax, telephone, social media, web chat, ad tech, online advertising, behavioral ads, anything in that electronic space. And it also applies equally to everybody. There's a lot of charities out there, a lot of political parties out there that feel like the law should not apply to them. That feels like there should be a different set of rules because they're trying to do good things or they're trying to promote an ideal rather than sell you stuff commercially. Well, the bad news is for those sorts of organizations, the law applies equally at the moment. Now, we do know we've got this new data protection bill potentially inbound where they're looking at making some sort of exemption. It's one of the things they're considering, but that's not here yet. Ro, I'm sure you've got some strong feelings on that as we walk into the definition of what direct marketing is and isn't.
Yes. So I just wanted to, if you could step back to the previous slide a second, there was a couple of things that I wanted to not rant, expound upon. So public telecommunications network or service doesn't mean state funded. So the whole public-private dichotomy thing here doesn't work. So public and private are not opposites. Public means, in theory, anyone can come along and join in. Now, in reality, there may be gateways for eligibility. So you might have to pay to access something. You might have to get a job somewhere to access something. But in theory, public telecommunication network or service is pretty much anything except your home Wi-Fi or a corporate VPN. So if it's on the internet, then PECA applies. Just to go back to the right of objection to direct marketing under data protection law, one thing that organizations often miss or overlook, probably because they're not spending their time being deeply geeky about data protection, is that if somebody objects to the use of their personal data for direct marketing purposes, they're not just objecting to receiving messages. They're objecting to the whole thing. So that's the selection of their data, the organization of their data, the use of their data, the disclosure of their data. All of that comes under processing, as I'm sure you all know. And so if somebody objects to their data being used for direct marketing, that means that not only do they have to go on a suppression list if their data is being used to send them emails or text or make phone calls, but also that their data has to be excluded from analytics and advertising where those are being used for targeted marketing. And that's a bit of a conundrum, because not a lot of commercial marketing and advertising platforms allow that kind of granular exclusion from the sort of back office operations that are being conducted for direct marketing. But actually, that is really critical, because while it's obvious as an end recipient whether or not somebody sent you an email, it's not necessarily obvious if the emails are stopped, but your data is still being used for example, demographic profiling or what's the word that was invented for Cambridge Analytica? Psychographic? I think it's something like that.
Psychometric?
Psychometric, that's the one, yes. Thank you, Charles. So it's important when thinking about how data protection and e-privacy law apply to direct marketing, to not just think about the very end point of interaction between organization and individual, or organization and other organization, but the whole life cycle, the whole data journey, and not just the data journey, but the connectivity journey as well, because that's obviously where PECA gets involved.
Wonderful, yeah. So we really have to understand what direct marketing is and isn't in order to know if we are direct marketing people. Now, the important thing to note is, it's got a really sort of generic definition within the Data Protection Act. And you can see that in the center of this slide here: the communication by whatever means of advertising or marketing material directed to particular individuals. I mean, so far, not very helpful. But the ICO guidance, in truth, actually does have a huge amount of assistance here to tell you what is and isn't direct marketing. So it's advertising, but also promotional material. And that promotional material doesn't have to be just selling something commercially, as we've said. It could be an aim or ideal. So if you're a charity, if you're a political party, and you want to sway someone to your point of view, you don't have to be selling them on a product. You could be selling them on an idea. And so it will cover things like charitable aims, it will cover political party campaigning, it will cover fundraising. It's pretty much anything where you're promoting who you are, not just selling people stuff. And as Ro said, the definition of processing is really, really wide. So it doesn't only include the sending of messages, but anything that's related to that whole direct marketing experience. So from any point that you're collecting the data in order to do direct marketing later, that will then count as part of that direct marketing processing, part of that direct marketing purpose of processing. So collecting data, profiling individuals, getting huge amounts of data in order to slice that data to send the right messages to the right people. That from that initial collection and research on people, before you start sending the messages, all counts as part of that direct marketing purpose. So what isn't direct marketing? That then becomes the next interesting point. So the law is very clear that what they call service messages are not direct marketing. So what's a service message? Service messaging is when you are doing something that's in relation to an existing contract, perhaps. So if you message someone to say, your subscription's about to end, do you want to renew it? Well, that's not direct marketing. That's actually to do with the existing contract that you're in. If somebody emails you and says, like Amazon, for example, and says, hey, we're sending you the book you've ordered, we're sending you the DVD you've ordered. How old am I? I'm still thinking about ordering DVDs. When they're ordering you, when they're emailing you to say we're sending you your stuff, that's in relation to the service. It's not direct marketing you something new. So even if you say no to direct marketing, even if you say, no, I don't want emails about direct marketing, you'll still receive service emails or service messaging. Of course, the complication comes when businesses try and mix the two. When businesses try and mix the two, when you get a service message that also include direct marketing. And as soon as you start to target individuals with those promotional messages that are not service messages, it then counts as direct marketing, obviously. If it doesn't use any personal data, you're promoting an ideal, it's not direct marketing again. So, TV adverts are a classic when you're just broadcasting to an audience, but you're not processing any personal data. You're broadcasting to an audience, you're marketing, but it's not directly to an individual. Neither is market research. Neither is actually gathering the data to do market research and sort of segment people to produce some sort of research task. However, if that research data is then subsequently going to be used in order to target direct marketing, it would then fall under that direct marketing processing. So that's a difficult one. The ICO also changed its definition of direct marketing, and this is somewhat controversial. Again, I'm sure Ro's going to have an opinion here as well, but they said that, generally speaking, if you're in the public sector, it's probably not direct marketing because it's in support of your public task. It's in support of your public task. The only thing that might be direct marketing that the public sector would do is if they've got more of a commercial paid for service, perhaps a membership at a public sector funded gym, or come to swimming lessons and pay for those swimming lessons. So if it's a more commercial service that the public sector does, it's likely to be considered direct marketing. But if it's to do with their public task, their obligations under law, the ICO would not consider that sort of public sector direct marketing. Ro, I don't know if you're a fan of that decision of the ICO. It did certainly change the game in terms of what we consider to be direct marketing or not.
It's very difficult because it's kind of impossible to put things in clean buckets that are either definitely marketing or definitely not marketing, because a lot of marketing is in the eye of the beholder. And when you've got mixed content, so content that is service or administrative messages, and that includes promotional content, the ICO's position has been up till now that any element of marketing makes the whole communication marketing.
Yes, definitely. And again, remember, as soon as it involves personal data, the entire of the sort of data protection law applies here. So I've just had a question here from Melanie. Hi, Melanie, by the way. She sent it to me privately, talking about information you might find online. Is that okay to use? Well, as soon as it becomes an individual's personal data, you've got to satisfy the Data Protection Act and your GDPR requirements. So if you find someone's email address online, for example, you would have to satisfy the being transparent and having a legal basis to hold it. Just because you can find it doesn't mean you can use it, and you'd have to satisfy all of the GDPR requirements as well as the PECR requirements. So to collect that data, you would have to have sent that individual a message to say, hey, I've taken your data. This is what I'm going to do with your data. Here's some sort of privacy notice. Here's the legal basis I'm holding it on, which may or may not be consent. We'll talk about legal basis in just a moment. But here's the legal basis I'm holding on. Here are your rights, which could be to object or to say no, or tell me to delete it, for example. So yes, there is no exemption under European law, under UK law, for what I'm going to call publicly available data. Very different in the US. If you can find it online, you can generally use it unless the individual opts out. Here in the EU, it's a very different, or here in the UK, it's a very different scenario where if just because you can find it doesn't mean you can use it. Just because it was left on there online, it doesn't mean you can take it and use it, for example. Okay, I think we now know what direct marketing is. I think we now know whether the PECR applies or the Data Protection Act applies. So now we have to look at different methodologies, different methods of marketing that we might use.
I just want to add my general rule of thumb for telling the difference between service messages and marketing messages. And that's if somebody needs to know the information in the message in order to understand or assert their rights, not just data protection rights, but consumer rights, employment rights, human rights, civil rights, etc., etc. So if they need the information in order to understand or assert their rights, it's a service message. If you want them to have the information because that might prompt them then to do something that also benefits you, it's a marketing message. So
that's a good rule of thumb. I really like that. I'd always thought of it in terms of invoices and receipts and, you know, things that were necessary for the actual service operation. But I actually quite like that definition. There you go. I've learned something today. There you go. Every day's a school day. Every day is a school day, as they say. Wonderful. So different methods, different rules is really, really something we need to learn here. So obviously postal marketing isn't electronic, right? And you've got this idea of an e-privacy directive or a PCR, I'm going to use the two terms interchangeably, that actually applies to public telecommunication systems. So obviously, if your direct marketing happens to be by post, you're not going to be subject to it. Yeah, might still be personal data, might still be subject to the Data Protection Act. But if it is subject to post, you know, and it's direct marketed, it is directly targeted to you, the Data Protection Act applies. Interesting enough, if it is postal marketing, which does not, is actually aimed at you individually, so to the recipient, to the homeowner, neither will apply. So you won't have data protection law because it's not personal data. You won't have PCR because it's not telecommunication systems. So actually, there's nothing you can really do for advertising or direct marketing that is sent to you that doesn't say, that doesn't include your details. It just is targeted at a town or a group of houses. So to the occupier, you know, to the resident, to the homeowner, right? You're not going to be able to do anything about that sort of marketing, except the Royal Mail does offer you a service where you can message the Royal Mail and ask them not to put leaflets and things through your door. Won't stop random leaflet droppers, will stop the Royal Mail. You can go to the Royal Mail and ask them to stop doing that. So postal marketing might be subject to the Data Protection Act if it's personal data, but it's not subject to PCR. So where the PCR comes in is any public telecommunication system, and we know that will include things like telephone marketing, for example. The actual e-privacy directive, being a European law, said that it's up to the individual member state to decide whether it should be on an opt-in and an opt-out basis, and we in the UK decided it should be on an opt-out basis. So generally speaking, telephone's a fair game. You can actually telephone somebody at home unless they tell you not to. So how do we tell you not to? Well, what we've done in the UK is we've implemented a preemptive national opt-out register. Now, if people want to go to the TPS here, the telephone preference service, the TPS, that's a website you can go to here in the UK called the Telephone Preference Service. Doesn't matter whether it's a business telephone, it doesn't matter whether it's your personal mobile phone, it doesn't matter whether it's a home phone. You can go to the TPS website and you can opt out. And then it is up to organizations to check any random calling they're going to do, any cold calling they're going to do against the TPS lists to make sure that they have taken into account people who have opted out. And then, of course, you have to then bear in mind individuals who can then opt out once you do get called and say, please don't call me anymore. There are also other elements here. So there is a mailing preference service you can sign up to, a fax preference service you can come up to. And one of my favorite things in the world, the baby mail service as well. And I think the baby mail service is one of the most compassionate things that we actually have in the UK at the moment, where if somebody has, for whatever reason, and trigger alert here, I apologize for it, If anyone has suffered with an unborn child, or a pregnancy that's been lost for any particular reason, you can actually register on the baby mail preference services. And actually, what's really lovely about that is that individual companies who are involved in the direct marketing of baby products should be checking that list to make sure they don't accidentally or deliberately mail someone who has lost their child. So, I think it's a really compassionate service. And these mailing preference service, these fax preference service, these telephone preference services are all things that you can sign up to. But it's actually only the telephone preference service that's actually got a legal statutory basis. You can actually get fined or penalised for not following the telephone preference service. I'm sure, Ro, again, you'll have some strong opinions on some of these preference services.
So yeah, the thing to understand about the DPAS is that because our UK implementation of e-privacy law allows for a signal for people to sign up to say just no, it has a statutory basis, which means if an organization is not checking the DPAS before making calls, they can get into legal trouble directly under PECA. However, the MPS, the mailing preference service, and the corporate DPS, which is where you put a business number on the do not call list, they're voluntary. So while they have implications for whether or not what you're doing is fair and lawful under data protection law, they can't actually be enforced under any kind of statutory basis. It would be an indication of ignoring the mailing preference service would not win you any brownie points with the ICO, but they couldn't actually, couldn't actually slap you on the wrist for not using the MPS. It would be that the data acquisition or processing wasn't lawful and fair. The fundraising preference service came along because charities, I'm afraid, were just blatantly ignoring the requirements of law and being massively cheeky about how they use people's data, backed by a considerable industry of data broking and cold calling and things like that. So the fundraising preference service is, again, not based on any statutory requirement. It's just the MPS and the TPS stuffed together specifically for charities. Email marketing is the area where there's greatest volume of really bad non-compliance, and B, very, very little enforcement against that non-compliance, apart from a few notable exceptions, which we will cover. And email is where a lot of organizations come unstuck because it has different rules depending on what you're sending and who to. So if the rules laid down in PECA don't actually reflect how email is used in this day and age. So bear in mind, PECA was written in 2003. That's nearly 20 years ago. And at the time, there weren't all that so many free email accounts, and it wasn't so common for small businesses to use Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, etc. So what PECA says is that whether or not the recipient is an individual or a corporate subscriber depends on who owns the address space that you're sending to. So if you're sending to randomperson@gmail.com, because that's a free email address, they would be considered an individual subscriber, even if they're using it for work purposes. And if you are sending an email address to a specific person@evilcorp.com, that would be considered sending to a corporate subscriber, even if the content you're targeting at them is focused on them marketing to an individual. So that's all nice and confusing. In general, I would say, and I'm not saying ignore PECA, I'm saying use a bit of common sense. If you are basing the fact that you have a corporate address space for your endpoint to get around PECA and say, oh, I can email this person because it's a corporate address space, even though what I'm doing is directly trying to flog them this shiny new gizmo that they'll pay for out of their own pocket. That's not really in the spirit of the thing. It's possible that when e-privacy law is refreshed, that issue will be cleared up. But for the moment, I would say look at the content and the intent of what you're trying to send and work out from that whether or not you're sending to an individual in a personal capacity or a business or an organization in a corporate capacity, whether that's business, government, charity, whatever. So just had a question in. If they're individual subscribers, does that mean they have no more rights? No one has rights under PECA, really. Kind of, sort of, but that's a legal technicality. What it is that sending unsolicited, so that's key, not asked for, direct marketing via electronic, public electronic networks to an organization has wider latitude. So you can do that until you're told to stop. Whereas sending unsolicited electronic marketing to an individual in their personal capacity, you're not allowed to do unless they've already said you can. And that already said you can bit could either be them signing up to something, or if they've bought something or they've got a quote for something, and at the time they did that, you got their details and said, FYI, we're going to use these details to send you marketing messages unless you say don't right now or at some time in the future, which is known as the soft opt-in. So there are different rules. It's not a question of, say, more or fewer rights. It's different rules depending on why you're sending the message and who your target of that message is.
Yeah, I mean, just to generalize, and the devil is always in the detail in these things, but yeah, it's generally going to be opt-out consent for business to business as a corporate subscriber, unless that business to business is using an individual email account. They're a very, very small business, much like a sole trader or under data protection law. So it's going to be an opt-out. If you're emailing people in the business space, you've got less privacy rights is the way they justify that. If you're a business, if you're working for a business, than if you are a private individual. If you're a private individual, it's going to be an opt-in. You're going to have to ask them first. If you're marketing directly to an individual, unless you're covered by the soft opt-in rule. And it's actually worth mentioning at the moment the soft opt-in rule, because it's commercial. In the context of a sale or a product or service, it really only applies to commercial sales. So, for example, charities, people promoting ideals such as political parties couldn't use the soft opt-in because it's not a commercial sale.
There was a big kerfuffle about charity fundraising and data protection e-privacy a few years back, which data protection nerds may remember. And charities were saying, you giving us a donation is equivalent to opting into our marketing. And obviously that didn't hold up under the law, although there was some pretty dodgy guidance flying around at the time. That totally didn't stand up to legal scrutiny, because a donation is not an opt-in, it's a donation. A donation is not the sale of a product or service. It is a voluntary gift. So all the charities who were saying, thank you very much for your donation, we're now going to spam you into oblivion, had to completely rethink their marketing strategies and processes. All of which effort could have been saved if they had gone to the law in the first place.
So just to clarify, your soft opt-in, it is very limited exemption. It's a very limited exemption. So as we said, generally speaking, with emails and any other sort of electronic communication, you know, it's going to be opt out if you're marketing to the corporate space, opt in if you're marketing to the individual private space. Not actually easy to tell, actually, because sometimes, for example, people might use, you know, websites like Facebook for business purposes. Equal people might use websites like LinkedIn for personal purposes. You know, if you downloaded your email addresses from LinkedIn, let's say, you'd find a real mix of people who have registered there with their corporate domain names and people who have registered with their individual domain names in their private capacity. So it's actually not as easy as you'd think sometimes to differentiate between, am I business to business mailing or am I business to individual mailing? If you are going to try and claim your soft opt-in, which is turns that opt-in to the individual back to an opt-out, you've got to satisfy 4 different rules here. And basically it's, was the data obtained from a sale or of a product or service? So if somebody buying something from you or somebody asking you for a query in order to buy something, and then you have to be marketing a similar product or service. So let's say you do 2 things, you sell high-heeled shoes and paving slabs. Well, if they put in a query and say, how much are your paving slabs, you can't start emailing them about the high-heeled shoes. Just makes sense. Every communication, including the first, you have to provide them with some sort of unsubscribe link or opt-out link so that the individual knows at any point that they can, you know, click a link and very easily opt out at any point. And does it include clarity? You know, does it include clarity that it is a direct marketing email? Does it include clarity that, you know, this is a reason why you're sending them the message, the reason why it's a linked or similar product and service? And, you know, is the individual able in, you know, very obvious and easy terms to be able to opt out? If the answer to any of these is no, you can't use the opt-out model. You can't use the soft opt-in model. You've got to go to that full prior GDPR consent opt-in model. And we'll be talking about what that means in just a second.
The other consideration for the soft opt-in is that where you were obtaining personal data in order to send your marketing message, obviously data protection law applies as well. So if you are demanding people's contact details before they can even browse a site or set up a shopping basket, then you're not connecting the data lawfully and fairly for marketing. If you are, what was the other example? Oh yes, abandoned trolley emails. So abandoned trolley emails are a big thing, and there's a lot of attempt to claim that this is okay under the soft opt-in or that it's a service message, but quite frankly, it's not to either of those, because if the abandoned trolley email, the data that was acquired in order to send it is collected before delivery and payment details are put into the trolley, then that's excessive and not sufficiently purpose limited, because the collection of that data is supposed to be for the purpose of fulfilling that order. It's not supposed to be for marketing.
It can be really nasty in terms of transparency as well. You know, when you're filling in a form online and they're automatically sucking that data off that form, sending it to a third party who then subsequently emails you in the case that you don't then go through with that. What I actually find is normally the privacy notice saying they're collecting it is probably right at the bottom of the form. You never even get to read it. Whereas if they are beginning to collect the data, you know, from the moment you start typing, that privacy notice should be explaining that right at the top of the web page rather than right at the bottom, so that they're being transparent right from that moment of collection. As soon as you start typing, we're collecting your data, we're passing it to a third party who might later email you if you abandon your trolley.
will.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. We're going to be short on time, so we're not going to spend hours and hours and hours talking about this next bit, even though it's really important. The final thing the e-privacy directive really talks about, as well as marketing, is online tracking and online surveillance. And basically, it's worth noting at the moment, when you're going to be using your public telecommunication system, the device is yours. And what it basically asks you to do is, if you're going to place something on that device, amend that device, store something on that device, access something on that device, then you need to ask them. Okay. Now, this isn't a legal basis. That's the important thing I want to mention. This is not a legal basis under the GDPR, like a consent for marketing. This is a completely separate thing. It just says, ask for permission if you're going to put something on their device. And the problem is with these marketing companies, and quite often a lot of what we now call cookie consent banners, is they confuse the two. They confuse the issue of legal basis for processing, if it's personal data under the data protection law, for consent to access someone's terminal equipment and place something on their equipment under PCR. The two are completely separate requirements: having a legal basis to process personal data and having someone's permission to put something on their device. So all those horrible cookie banners, which is the way they're quite often described, and quite often that's the rationale used by government to amend or free up, you know, some of our rights under data protection law, is to get rid of all those horrible cookie banners that GDPR introduced. Well, not necessarily. You know, this requirement has actually been around since 2003 for individual websites to tell people to be transparent and say, hey, we're going to put something on your machine and we need to ask for your permission to do that. What the GDPR did change is the definition of consent. The definition of consent. So, as we know, the GDPR changed the definition of consent to, you know, something that had to be informed and transparent and opt-in. You know, you couldn't just assume or imply consent from their continued website use anymore. So overnight, all of these cookie banners pop up that says, hey, we'd like to put something on your machine. It's not a legal basis under the GDPR. It is just permission to put something on your machine because we'd like to track you around the internet, but now we have to tell you about it. And of course, the marketing wheels and the marketing ad tech industry have made that as hard as possible for you to do so, and mix this whole idea of permission to put something on your machine up with a legal basis for processing personal data under the GDPR. Quite frankly, it's a mess. The only thing they don't have to ask your permission for is anything that is strictly necessary for that service to operate. Cookies, for example, that might enable a shopping basket for you to use that website, rather than anything purely optional like analytics or advertising technology cookies. I'm sure, Rowenna, you've got 100 different things to add here.
I mean, the topic of DPA cookies and online tracking is a whole webinar on its own. Yeah. Which something that might be being worked on at the moment. So it's probably quite difficult to get into it here in any meaningful way. But just to say that regardless of whether or not cookies are involved, if advertising is being targeted to an individual user, whether or not that other aspects of that user's identity are known, but a particular user on the basis of their activity having been profiled as interests, then there is a pretty strong argument that there is personal data involved, because their device identifier, especially in this day and age where kind of everyone has their own bit of kit. We don't have so many one computer per family situations. So a device identifier is highly likely to be personal data when it is used to target advertising that is tailored specifically to the interests or behaviors of the user of that device.
And Katie's just put up a wonderful point online here that says pet peeve, where the first layer of your cookie banner says, I reject cookies, I don't want cookies, I'm not going to give you my consent for cookies, but there is a hidden legitimate interests option where you would also need to register your objection to that legitimate interest reason for processing data for advertising technology? Well, I would argue, in fact, there's a couple of court cases going through at the moment, notably with the Belgian regulator against the IAF, that's the European Internet Advertising Forum, which actually created this methodology. They call it TCF2, Transparency and Consent Framework 2, which is ironic because it does neither. It doesn't, it messes up the idea of consent, and it's not very transparent. And then, so the Belgian versus the European, IAB, Internet Advertising Bureau, is the case to watch there, where they have deliberately, used really deceptive design practices, deliberately confused the idea of legal basis under the GDPR and consent to access your device under e-privacy. And there's just enough wiggle room in there because of the incompatibility and definitions between them both to cause you headaches. So important thing to note here, you do have to be transparent whenever you're doing any sort of marketing online. Even though the PCR is an earlier law, he inherits this definition of consent from the GDPR. Any freely given, specific, informed and unambiguous indication of wishes by an action, you signify you're agreeing. So you shouldn't be dropping cookies till someone's agreed. You should be being transparent about any sort of electronic tracking you're doing, especially for advertising and profiling. And it's just worth mentioning GDPR legal basis here, that even though I've said e-privacy is completely separate legal basis, when it comes to direct marketing, you do have to choose a legal basis. And necessary for legal obligation, no, it's not necessary to advertise for a legal obligation. Is it necessary for contract? No, that would be a service message. Is it necessary for vital interests? No. Is it necessary for public tasks? No. Is it necessary for a legitimate interest where the organization could claim their rights beat your rights? I'm going to argue no, but the ICO says possibly. So I think generally speaking with direct marketing, you're down to consent. I just wonder very quickly, Ro, whether you want to just mention your thoughts about legitimate interest as a basis for advertising.
So the key thing with legitimate interests is that there has to be a process by which the interests being pursued are identified and attributed and tested for legitimacy, and are then weighed against the potential impact on the data subject to see if they unnecessarily burden the data subject's rights and freedoms. Because this process is left in the hands of organizations to do kind of on the honor system, it's very, very rarely done well or appropriately. What tends to happen is that an organization decides to do something, gets all the way to nearly the end of it, and then somebody goes, oh, we have to write legitimate interests assessment on a piece of paper justifying what we've already decided to do, instead of actually doing scrutiny and a balancing test. But there is so much it depends around here that it's impossible to say that legitimate interest either is or isn't appropriate for advertising, because the details of what is being advertised, who it's being advertised to, how are those people targeted for advertising, what are the channels of communication, all that stuff, that all matters. Yeah, blanket statements, I would say that based on observation, the advertising industry and the marketing industries have so abused legitimate interests that I would not be inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to good faith.
I totally agree. Yeah,
that's a personal one.
And again, we have to separate out this idea of GDPR legal basis from putting a cookie on a terminal device, which is not a GDPR legal basis. It's just permission under PCR. It's not a legal basis. It's a completely separate, different thing. And you may require either and, both or none, depending on what you're doing. I'm not going to go through this, but I just want to mention that if you are going to rely on consent, the UK GDPR does set a high standard. It does mean offering people real choice and control, putting them in charge, building trust, enhancing your reputation, which means a positive opt-in, right? I think someone mentioned in the chat earlier that Honda and Flybe messed up around the time the GDPR arrived by emailing people and saying, we're not sure we've got your consent, can we have it? And those emails were actually, even though they were trying to do the right thing by asking for consent, they sort of self-incriminated because those emails didn't have consent to be sent in the first place. They sort of self-incriminated by saying we didn't have those, that permission. So you're going to have to be clear, you're going to have to be granular, and that means you can't consent to everything anymore or whole third parties. Really, we should give people user preference panels where they can narrowly give their consent. Do they want consent about one product but not another? Do they want consent for one email a week or one email a month? Do they want consent via telephone differently to email? Do they want consent from you separate to your partner organizations? So trying to keep it granular and concise and giving people the ability to get out as easy as it was to get in is going to be the name of the game. As soon as we make it harder to get out than it was to get in, which means practically we're going to have to keep our consents under review. And that's going to be a pain. It's going to be pain. And also, if you're getting email addresses from other people, you're going to have to ask all those searching questions from other people as well, in terms of, where did you get the data from? How do I know I've got permission? How have you been transparent? Do I have a legal basis to use this? And finally, just remember that the GDPR gives you an absolute right to object to direct marketing or withdraw your consent if that's what you're based upon. And also remember that someone saying, don't process my data for direct marketing is not quite the same thing. Actually saying, I want to be put on the do not email list is not the same as them writing and saying, I withdraw my legal basis of consent, please delete the data. There's going to be a lot of guidance here on the ICO website, and we'll send these slides round to everybody so you can look it all up. But really, we want you to get you thinking about the right questions to ask. So the first question you're going to need to ask is, well, is it personal data or not? Because that will decide if the GDPR applies or the Data Protection Act applies. And if you're going to be using a public telecommunication system, then the PCR applies. If it is personal data, you're going to have to ask about transparency and legal basis. You're going to have to determine if it's actually a marketing message or not, if it's direct marketing message or not, if it's a service message or not. Then the rules change again, depending on the channel of marketing. Is it post? Is it email? Is it electronic ad tech? Is it telephone marketing? And then the rules change again, depending on if it's a business or an individual, and that'll give you your opt-out and opt-in rules. So before we just hand back to Adi, Kunbi, to just finish. Any last messages from you, Rowenna?
There is so much that can be said on this topic, and just make a quick reference to the recent Halfords case, where this really rested on whether a message was marketing or a service message. And it's very well worth reading the ICO's write-up of that case, because they explain their reasoning really well on how they are trying to determine whether or not a message is marketing or is a service message. And for me, the key thing about that case was that because they sent the message to people who were not active customers, it therefore couldn't be a service message because they weren't receiving a service.
Yes, really good case. Okay, back to you, Kunbi.
Thank you very much, Ralph and Rowenna. It has been an amazing session. I've been taking notes, and I'm sure everyone else has taken, copious notes. If you're very interested in this topic, and you should be, because you don't want to end up like Halfords, you should be planning to attend our data protection training in January, focused, as you can see on the slide, on applying data protection to your marketing activities. This course is usually £750, but we have a discount going on if you register soon. So please do so. Can we have the next slide, please, Ralph? Just very quickly to show you the other services we offer at DPAS. And this range from training, BCS certified training, DPO, DPM as a service, creating your ROPAS, conducting audits, CCTV audits, policies, subject access requests, redaction, and other sorts of services, cybersecurity, legal services. If you want to know more, please feel free to send us an email at info@dataprivacyadvisory.com. So we're going to be sending the slides and you'll see this. So feel free to reach out to us if there's anything we can help with at your organization. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much, Ralph and Rowenna. We've had an amazing session. We're very grateful to you. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.